What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So it is time for our weekly redraft. We do a redraft every single Thursday. We started 10 weeks ago with the 2020 draft. We've done 10 up until this point. This is going to be our 11th. And we got the 2010 draft. 2010 draft was a very interesting draft. There's no real superstar. So at the top, you can make an argument for like basically 1 through 4 on this to still go first overall. When looking at it, this is the original order. Taylor Hall, Seguin, Goodbranson, Johansson, Niederreiter, Connolly, Skinner, Burmistrov, Granlund, and McIlrath. So yeah, you got like 3 straight up busts, 3 very good high-level players. It's going to be interesting. It's definitely going to be interesting when looking at this draft. But at first overall, heading to the Edmonton Oilers, I have Tyler Seguin instead of Taylor Hall. When looking at Tyler Seguin, he was a very good player right out of the rip with the Boston Bruins. Obviously helped them win the Stanley Cup back in 2011. And then he was a very, very good player. He had like 67 points the following year. Tyler Seguin, once he eventually got to Dallas for 6 years, was basically point per game back when point per game was like 90, 95 points, basically equivalency now. So he was a top 10 center, pretty no doubt, top 15, top 20 player in the entire NHL for more than half a decade. Yes, eventually he did deal with some serious labrum problems that kind of kept them out after the 2020 season when they went on that cup run. But I still think when looking at Tyler Seguin, he's bounced back pretty well. He had back-to-back like 50-point seasons. And this year he has 21 goals, 25 assists, 46 points in 59 games. He's a pretty damn good second liner at this point. So I think when you compare the fact that he did have a prolonged peak, some of these other guys are going to have much more shorter or much more inconsistent, injury-riddled kind of peaks. For 5-6 years, Tyler Seguin was one of the best players in the entire NHL. So I think he gets the number 1 spot here over Taylor Hall, over the other guys that I'm going to have at 2, 3, and 4. So Tyler Seguin, you're heading to Edmonton. Hope you enjoy. Second overall, Boston initially took Seguin. I have them taking Mark Stone. Mark Stone obviously took a lot longer to develop compared to some of these other guys I'm going to list, considering he was a 6th round pick. Wasn't really a high elite player until 2018, 2019. He was a solid like 60, 65-ish point guy in his 3 or 4 seasons before he eventually got traded to Vegas. Very good defensively. But basically, since he's got to Vegas, he's been one of the best right wingers, just two-way right wingers in the entire NHL. Basically, point per game every single season. Fantastic defensively. That kind of guy that you want in the playoffs. Obviously, captained the Vegas Golden Knights to a Stanley Cup. So I think it makes sense for the Boston Bruins to go with the guy like Mark Stone here, considering, yes, they needed that immediate help with the Tyler Seguin, but especially when looking at a Mark Stone, if they had him during 2014 up until now, they probably win another Stanley Cup. So I think Mark Stone from 2019 on is pretty much without a doubt the best player in this draft. Yes, again, he didn't have that immediate impact like a Seguin, which I do value. That's why Seguin is ahead of a Stone, because Seguin probably had like 300, 400 points before Stone even was a half a point per game player. But I do think Stone going forward is going to be the best guy in this draft, and he goes second overall. Third overall was initially Goodbranson to the Florida Panthers. I have Vladimir Tarasenko here. When looking at Tarasenko's prime from 2016 or 2014 to 2016, no, 2014 to 2018, his five season prime, 37 goals, 40 goals, 39 goals, 33 goals, 33 goals. And again, this was in the mid-2010s. This wasn't nowadays where the scoring is 3.2 goals per game per team. This was in the 2.7 kind of slower era. He was the second best goal scorer in the entire NHL, really only behind Ovechkin during that stretch. After that, he did deal with a serious shoulder injury that only limited him to 34 games over the 2020 and 2021 season. So when looking at him, he had an 82-point season eventually once he was fully healthy. But going forward, he projects kind of as a solid, good middle sixer, good second liner. So I think a third overall to the Florida Panthers, that'd be very interesting. Funny enough, obviously on the Florida Panthers right now. So I think he is the third best player, third most. And he was very consistent throughout his prime and even post-prime or post-injury. He's been a solid player. So he goes third overall here to the Florida Panthers. Fourth overall, Columbus got Ryan Johansson. I am going Taylor Hall here. It's pretty weird having a Hart winner fourth in a redraft, but obviously Hall was not the most consistent player. He only had 3 seasons above a point per game. That one Hart year was obviously insane. But besides that, I wouldn't say he's a disappointment for a first overall pick, but he just hasn't been able to stay consistent every single year. He'd go for a point per game. Then the following season, he'd have like 57. So when looking at Taylor Hall, yes, a very good player, but not as consistent as a Tyler Seguin, as a Tarasenko, as a Stone throughout their career. Still has almost 700 points in his career, 697. But right now, considering he's coming off a torn ACL and has been rapidly regressing in his game the last 2 to 3 years. That he was very good from the 2000s up until about 2021, but with those injuries, I'm not sure how he's going to project going forward in his career compared to a Tarasenko, compared to a Seguin, compared to a Mark Stone that's still playing at a high level. So I do have him here at number 4 compared to maybe him sticking at first overall or going second overall. There's just far too much uncertainty when it comes to Taylor Hall. 5th overall, my New York Islanders initially took Nino Niederreiter. I have them taking Evgeny Kuznetsov. He was an elite near point per game center for the Washington Capitals from 2016 up until like 2022. He had 450 points in 502 games. That's around, I think, like 75 points per season. Could have won the Conn Smythe in 2018. He was absolutely insane. He had 32 points in 24 games, obviously eventually with the Ovechkin, just because he had more goals. But in his prime, he was sniffing as a top 10 center in the entire league, maybe even like top 8, top 7. He has fallen off, especially of late in the last 2 seasons. I think that has to do more with his off-the-ice activities and say maybe the off-the-ice activities have bled massively into his on-the-ice activities, considering he is starting to just get up there in age, entering his 30s. So in looking at Kuznetsov, I still think he is safely the 5th best guy here, but going forward, it is a little bit concerning about the level of play, but considering how much better his 5-year prime was compared to the guys at 6, 7, 8. I think he is the pick here at 5th overall. To my New York Islanders, him and Tavares form a pretty lethal 1-2 punch down the middle for the mid to late 2010s. 6th overall, Tampa Bay went Conley. I have them going Jeff Skinner. Jeff Skinner was pretty impressive on just straight up bad Carolina teams. He hasn't made the playoffs one time in his entire career. He was there in Carolina for like 8 seasons. Not a lot of talent around him, but despite that, he was still going for around 30 and 30 a season. Gets traded to Buffalo, puts up 40 goals, gets the contract, sucks for 2 years, but the last 3 years, he has yet again been a very good player. 2 years ago, 33 goals, 30 assists, 63 points. Last year, over point per game, and this year going to be around that 30 and 30 range. So he's had a very long career. I think he is pretty much the 6th best player in this draft, and going forward, I think he's going to age pretty solid. He's going to remain a a low-end first liner, good second liner on a playoff team. So I think when looking at Tampa Bay, you pair him with the Steven Stamkos back in 2010, and they just absolutely run with it. They probably still have a shit ton of success throughout the 2010s, and he would play very good with the Steven Stamkos. Next up, 7th overall, Carolina initially went with Jeff Skinner. I have them going with Brock Nelson. He was a very solid 50-ish point middle sixer from 2015 up until 2021, but watching him night in and night out, he has absolutely elevated his game in the last 3 seasons. 100 goals, 91 assists, 193 points, in 222 games the last 3 seasons, which is on pace for 38 goals, 34 assists, 72 points a year. That is crazy stat line considering no one really talks about him. I think he's been one of the most underrated players in the NHL. Mind you, he plays on the second line. He centers the second line most of the time. He doesn't play with Barzal or Horvat. So when looking at Brock Nelson on a Carolina team, especially a Carolina team that was more of a late bloomer, considering, as I mentioned with Skinner before, they stunk during the 2010s. You get a guy like Brock Nelson that was a more so late bloomer. He joins the core eventually in 2014, 2015, starts building towards that. I think it makes sense for the Carolina Hurricanes to take Brock Nelson at this 7th overall spot. 8th overall, Atlanta obviously took Burmistrov, well, Winnipeg, I guess, in this scenario. I have them taking Tyler Toffoli, similarly to Nelson, although he did get more love because he did win a Stanley Cup back in 2014. Toffoli was a solid top 6 guy for the most part, around 50 to maybe 55 points a season. He wasn't I feel like there is some revisionist history on Tyler Toffoli. He was never this absolute stud until recently. Similarly like a Brock Nelson, last 4 seasons, 114 goals, 104 assists, 216 points in 270 games. Last 4 seasons has been a 33 goal, 31 assists, 64 point pace guy. Again, playing some of his best hockey of late. And yeah, before that, he played 6 or 7 seasons, very solid, very good second line center. And now going forward, I'm not sure he's going to be hitting 73 points or even maybe 35 goals again, like he's probably going to hit this season. But he is that ideal playoff veteran second line sniper that you want on your team. And he should be playing at a pretty high level for the next 2 to 3 years as well. And Winnipeg definitely could have used a player like that. 9th overall, the Minnesota Wild initially took Mikael Granlund. I have them taking Zach Hyman. Hyman's definitely a weird one with this because he also took long, even longer than Mark Stone to develop as a 5th round pick. He wasn't a full-time NHLer until 2017. And with Matthews and Marner, he was a solid player. He definitely wasn't what he was with McDavid right now. He was around the 30-ish goal, 25 assist-ish guy for his final 3 years in Toronto. Obviously, he had a bit of a down year in Edmonton his first year, but then absolutely exploded. 82 points last year. Going to get probably like 50 goals right now. I can't put him ahead of a Nelson and Toffoli just because they were far better players from 2014 to like 2019, 2020. And also, although I love Zach Hyman, he is the perfect complementary player to these elite centers like a Matthews and a McDavid. Let's be honest, if Brock Nelson and Tyler Toffoli were put on the same career path, same trajectory as Zach Hyman, they would have put up far better results early on and probably the same results now. So when looking at Hyman, again, very good player, but obviously gets elevated by the situations that he's in, the talent that he does play with, which you got to be a good player to play with elite talent. But when looking at that, I do think when you look at the totality of their career, who had a much bigger impact far, because Hyman wasn't even in the goddamn league, than them, I think Hyman at 9th makes sense. It's a little bit too much recency bias to put Hyman over a Toffoli, over a Brock Nelson, in my opinion. So Hyman goes 9th overall to the Minnesota Wild. Pretty solid spot. And then at 10th overall, instead of Dylan McGillrath, I have them taking Cam Fowler. Cam Fowler walked into the NHL immediately at 19 years old and had 40 points. It was very impressive. And while he never reached the potential that we really expected after having 40 points in 2011 as a goddamn 18, 19-year-old, he's been a solid top pairing guy for most of his career. Bad Ducks teams for the most part the last 4 or 5 years that have kind of tanked his stats. He also just isn't that good of a player anymore. He has started to regress. But yeah, during this guy's prime, Ducks were highly competitive. He was playing a major role on those Ducks teams. So when looking at the New York Rangers, they were also a highly competitive team in the early mid-ish 2000s for the most part. So I think he would have fit in very good on that New York Rangers team. So I have him going 10th to the Rangers. Some honorable mentions: Brian Rust, basically just a slightly worse version of Hyman, took longer to develop, has been a very good complementary piece to Sidney Crosby. Mikael Granlund had 2 very elite seasons in Minnesota, but hasn't really been the same player since, even though he's having a bit of a bounce back. Jaden Schwartz is a good shout. Nino Niederreiter. Ryan Johansson has just fallen off a cliff far too much. Frederik Andersen got drafted in this draft as well as 2012. I included him in 2012. I didn't think it'd be fair to also include him in 2010. He went in the 7th round, but obviously got redrafted. And that's it. I'm going to throw up the graphic right now, but the order is Tyler Seguin, Mark Stone, Tarasenko, Hall, Kuznetsov, Skinner, Nelson, Toffoli, Hyman, and Fowler. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about this? Who would you move up? Who would you move down? And I'll be seeing the next one.